Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and its co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby. How are you?
I am fantastic. This is a continuation of the show we did last week. This is all about systems in a single-engine trainer, all the planes that we fly to teach in and the planes that you do most of your check rides in. We've talked about it many, many times, but the whole systems conversation is a weak one for general aviation pilots, and hopefully we're going to share some wisdom and some information and really just challenge listeners, I think, to dive in a little bit deeper to Section 7 of their POH and learn more about their systems. I think I asked the same question last week, but how well do students do when you ask systems questions, or applicants do when you ask systems questions?
It's all over the place. Obviously, if you pass, you meet the standards. But I think this is all something that we could do a better job with. Understanding. When you pull that yoke back, what are you doing other than making the airplane pitch up if you have enough airspeed? What are you really doing? Are you moving the trim tab? Are you moving the horizontal stabilizer? Are you pulling a cable? What are you doing? And it's not rocket science. I mean, to dovetail off our show from a while back where we actually talked to an astronaut, little airplanes are not rocket science. What are we doing when we do everything? When we flip a switch on, what are we doing? What are we turning on? What is it actually doing when we pull that flap handle up? How are those flaps going up? What's making them going out? Is it driving a motor that's making the flaps go out, or is it just pulling a cable? And I think you get into bigger airplanes, the systems become more complex. So it's a building block. So if we start learning the systems in our Warrior or 172 or whatever the small airplane may be, we're setting the groundwork for learning that. Now we're going to learn the systems of the Beech Baron or the Travel Air. Now we're going to learn the systems in a Cessna Caravan. Now we're going to learn the systems in a small jet, and onto a big jet. When we talked to Kevin Ford a while back on the show, The Astronaut, I was asking him about, I says, well, what's ground school like on the space shuttle? And he just kind of laughed. He said because they would spend 2 weeks on each system usually.
Wow.
And I'm guessing on a space shuttle there's a whole bunch of systems.
I would say there are.
Yeah. So, of course you get up to space and you don't, your options are limited. So that's why. But, I think we could do a better job in general aviation.
You don't think my mechanic would just swing by and fix something in space? I think that you're very limited for sure.
Yeah, imagine the bill for that.
Yes. So last week we talked a lot about a number of different systems, the flight controls, kind of the airframe in general. We talked a little bit about the flaps and those sorts of things. And then we really just ran out of time because we were talking about even how control locks work and the difference between how you use a seatbelt and a Piper versus a control lock for the yoke. And then bigger planes have more control locks and more removed before flight red tags, right? So this week we're just going to kind of continue the conversation and talk about things. And we've talked a lot about engines in the past. We did a whole show on engines in the past. We talked a lot about engine naming last week, but we talked about fuel and some of those things about fuel and how fuel works. I thought we'd just continue on the list, and we talked a little bit about props. I don't think I spent enough time learning about a prop. You've always talked about how how long yours was when you were a student because you read the POH. But what's the difference at a high level that you, both a professional pilot and an examiner, would expect someone to really understand about props at a commercial level?
Well, at a commercial level, you're going to have some complex time or technically advanced time, and so you're going to have some time in an airplane where you're able to change the pitch of the propeller. Just a funny story. I was talking to an airline pilot a few weeks ago, and he had let his CFI expire, and he wanted to get it renewed. And I told him that I didn't have the ability to do that as an examiner, but and he was somehow he felt the need to tell me about the amount of flight time that he had, and he says, "Well, I got 27,000 hours, 25,000 of it is in a complex airplane." And I pointed out to him that by definition, that the 787 that he flies is, well, okay, back in the day, I should say, prior to the rules being changed, but back in the day, a 787 was not a complex airplane because it did not have a controllable pitched propeller. And I guess the definition of complex airplane still remains the same. You got to have a controllable pitch propeller, a retractable landing gear, and movable flaps. And so 787 does not meet the definition of a complex airplane. But having said that, I would expect an applicant to understand, in a general sense, the inner workings of a propeller. I remember as a young kid, my father built a lot of model airplanes. I mean, and in my house down in the basement, we had a display case, and in that display case was probably 130, 140 model airplanes. And over in the corner, what we had a model of a rotary airplane engine that had a propeller on it, and the propeller, you could actually change the pitch of the propeller. And this is a big model of an engine. It was probably 14 inches diameter, and the diameter of the prop was probably a little bit longer than that, maybe 16 inches. And I remember my father, at a very young age, him showing me how that propeller moved, the blade angle of the propeller moved. And the way he explained it to me, he said, this is how an airplane changes gears. Just like we shift from first to second to third to fourth gear in a car, this is the way an airplane changes gears, is by changing the angle of the blade of the propeller. And to this day, I've gone all over the internet trying to find that model to build it, because it was a light bulb moment for me. And I don't know how old I was. I was probably 8 to 10 years old when it happened. But I remember going and playing with that model all the time and moving the blade angle of the propeller. And that was my introduction to it.
So, I mean, it's a pretty complex system, no pun intended, right? That you now have a prop control on top of the mixture and the throttle. They all look pretty similar, except they're different colors. But it's also, even in a fixed pitch, the prop kind of twists, and that twist is pretty important. And I had a pretty good instructor that walked me through it. And if you also, in conjunction with this podcast, go read Chapter 7 of the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, there's a few pages on props, and it has a really good dissection of the prop and how really it's the angle of attack by which the blade is striking the air, right? Changes throughout that twist, and how much, how thick and how much of that prop is going to hit it. What I find interesting about a fixed pitch prop, it's moving almost 3 times as fast on the outer edge as it is from 10 inches out from the middle of the prop, right? So if you went from the center of the nose cone to 10 inches out, the prop is moving about 130 knots in the circular motion while it makes 1 revolution. The very tip of the prop is moving almost 400 knots. So it's traveling a much longer, greater distance, but it's still only turning the same RPM count as the other inside part is, right? So the way that blade's designed and made over years and years of testing is so that it works equally both in the middle and at the far tip of the prop, which provides the same amount of actual lift, but it's actual thrust, right? So what moves us through the air. Pretty cool to understand that, but you should understand it. And then if you don't know a lot, you should understand that the prop also can't have much inconsistency because we don't want it to be imbalanced, right? So in a training environment, we want to check, and in a non-training environment, you want to check and make sure there's not any dings or scratches or things that would create something to be unbalanced, or the smallest of crack. You got to think, if there's one thing that takes more force on it than anything on an airplane, it is the prop. You got to think it's pulling 2,000 pounds through the air. It's taking a whole lot of force as it moves us through the air. So you don't want any indentations or any dents or any cracks. It's going to cause a big problem for sure.
Yeah, and I think one thing that most of us can probably relate to is a ceiling fan. Just imagine a ceiling fan in your living room. I mean, if you've ever gone in a room and you see a ceiling fan that is just vibrating, uncontrollably, it's because that ceiling fan is unbalanced somehow. And that's what we get if we take a chunk out of a propeller on the surface. It may not look like a big deal, but you take that, the speed at which the tip of that propeller is moving around, and that propeller may be now significantly unbalanced, and unwanted vibration in the air is something that we don't want.
Yeah, and I've had like where you could tell a piece of gravel might have jumped up and hit the prop and put a pretty good little ding in the leading edge. Just like you wouldn't want a big ding in the leading edge of your wing, you don't want a ding in the leading edge of your prop. And called my mechanic and very nicely ran down and took a file and filed it off and made it to where it was safe and put a logbook entry in the logbook, and away we go, right? There's tolerances on a prop like everything else in aviation, and they're meant to have those fixes in real time like that for sure.
Yeah. And you mentioned this. I mean, I distinctly remember sitting in an aerodynamics class in college, and it was another light bulb moment for me. I mean, the instructor, he never would say wing. It was always airfoil. And then he pointed out that a propeller was nothing more than rotating wings. And I just thought, wow, yeah, okay, it is. There's an angle of attack of the propeller. And so, yeah, you don't want the front of your wing to be dinged, just like you don't want the front of your propeller to be dinged.
That's right. They are both just airfoils for sure. Next, I guess we talked about the fuel quite a bit last week, so we'll skip that. We've had an electrical system conversation, but let's dive into some components that I think are misinterpreted or misinformed. I again have a flight school with 15 or so aircraft, varying models of Pipers and Cessnas, very similar, but also have their differences. I think people misinterpret or misclassify a voltmeter and an ammeter. Have you ever seen anybody call a voltmeter an ammeter or an ammeter a voltmeter? And is there a difference, Wally?
Oh yeah. There's definitely a difference. You know, a voltmeter is going to measure the voltage on a battery. We go up to any battery and put a voltmeter on it and measure the voltage right now, where an ammeter is basically the way we use it. It's I guess a way of thinking of it is output of the alternator, which is the battery charger. Okay,
Yep.
You know, we have all these fancy words, but think of the alternator as the battery charger, if you will.
So I've had two things. Rewind real quick. You should know what voltage your system is in your aircraft, and I don't think.
Oh yeah.
I don't
Yes.
think I knew that. Honestly, I don't think I knew that till I owned the flight school, and you're not really taught that. And there were Cessnas that were built, Cessna 172s that were built that are 14 volts, or sometimes referred to as 12 volts. We'll get to that in a second. Some that are 28 volts, or sometimes referred to as 24 volt systems. Pipers, almost all Pipers are 14 volt systems, but you can find it in the very front of your POH, and you should know how many volts you're supposed to have. Jumping back to the ammeter voltmeter conversation, a lot of times we'll have a renter come back inside after they get in the airplane and start it and say the alternator is just not charging it to 0 amps on the amp meter, and there's a reason why it could be 0. It could be right on 0. It's an analog gauge, so it could look like it's right on 0 when it's just above 0, but that just means there's a significant load drawing on that system. Maybe I have all the lights on. Maybe I'm doing my pre-flight, and I've got, I had all my strobes, my nav, my beacon, my radios, all that stuff on. It might not be able to charge faster than it's draining, I guess is what's happening at 0. But if I had a voltmeter, the voltmeter would tell me exactly what's coming out of the alternator. And the difference between 12 and 14 or 24 and 28 is that the alternator puts out a couple extra volts of charge to, I guess, outrun the other voltage that's in the battery, right? So if it's 12 volt battery, the alternator probably is putting out 14 volts. And that way, if you have a voltmeter, what would it tell you? Well, if you got in a plane, started it, and the voltmeter was telling you 12 volts, what would that tell you?
Well, it would tell you that it's not being charged at this point.
That's right. I got an alternator problem. Would you go in that situation? Like, let's say it's night flight IMC, starts playing, it's 12 volts, you're indicating on a voltmeter. Would you go?
Would not go. Absolutely
Would not go. That is a no-go choice, people. And so I think sometimes people say, well, it's a 12 volt system. It says 12 volts. I've got 12 volts. But I think this is what I'm talking about when I say practical knowledge of these systems is the alternator's putting out 14 volts. Your 12 volt system should say 14 volts if you have a voltmeter. And if you only have an ammeter, then it's probably going to say somewhere between 0 and an indication of about half, because it's about the draw and can it charge that. If it was below 0, it's going to indicate that the system's using more than it can be charged, and I would not go in that situation as well. You might be getting a little bit of charge, but it's probably not enough, or you have a bad battery, something like that.
Right. And something I bring up on check rides is that usually as I'm sitting in the room with the applicant, I have my phone and it's dependent on how many check rides I've done that day. A lot of times my phone is plugged in and it's being charged. And the applicant sitting across to me will usually have their phone and it's sitting there on the table. And more times than not, their phone is not being charged. And I will say to them, are you experiencing an alternator failure right now with your phone? And they look at me a little strange. And the point that I'm trying to make is that they are experiencing an alternator failure as we're sitting there because their phone is not being charged. I'll pick up my phone and it's got the little white cord hanging out from underneath going into the wall, and I'll say, is my phone experiencing an alternator failure right now? And then they start to get it and they'll say, oh yeah, I understand. Your phone is not experiencing an alternator failure. I am. And I say, exactly. I said, so we manage, in everyday life, we manage alternator failures. We do it with our telephones, our phones in our pocket. You know, if you're going to be gone away from a power source for 14, 16 hours, we probably need to manage that phone. We need to do something. We need to turn it off or put it in airplane mode or close out some apps or something like that. Turn off the GPS on it to save electricity. So we do this. We do it every day, and we don't even think about it.
Yeah, that's a good point on really how you might report a squawk with the electrical system to your flight school or an FBO. You know, that phone might be plugged in and have the cable in the phone, and the phone's not charging. That doesn't mean that the alternator's bad. That means something in that system's bad, which could be the wall plug, it could be the power coming to that plug, could be a wire to that plug. It could be a lot of different things. I think what your flight school wants to know or your FBO wants to know is that I wasn't getting an indication that my alternator was charging, and then they'll go troubleshoot where the loose wire is or what's loose. I think when we did our alternator show, we had a full electrical outage on an aircraft shortly thereafter, and it wasn't the alternator at all. It was the wire on the back of the alternator had come loose, and it just goes to show that it's not always maybe the system, but part of that system that is indicating there's an issue.
And with that in mind, if you do, whether it's owner-owned airplane, a rental airplane, or whatever, if you do have a situation like that where you think something's wrong, man, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Snap a picture of it. If it's something that's transient, that's coming and going, take a short video of it and come in and show it to the mechanic or the owner of the airplane. Say, this is what I had, and man, that really helps.
It definitely does. And to that point, I guess, but still around the alternator, let's talk about some switches. Like most of these trainers have 3 on-off switches, I'll call it. We've normally got a master switch that also has an alternator switch as part of it. And then we normally have a avionics switch. If you're lucky, you have an avionics switch. What's the difference between the on-off switch and the alternator switch, I guess, Wally?
Well, most airplanes are going to have a battery switch. One half of the master switch is the battery switch, and the other half of the switch is the actual alternator itself. And that way we have the ability just to isolate the electrical system. We may have an alternator that is producing too much voltage, maybe or not enough. It's malfunctioning. So we typically have the ability to turn the alternator off, remove the alternator from the electrical system. Now we have a airplane that is being electrically powered just by the battery. And how much battery time do we have? Well, I get a lot of times, you're guaranteed 30 minutes. Well, people, you're not guaranteed anything. You might have 30 minutes. Heck, you might have 2 hours. You might have 10 minutes. I don't know. You have something less than infinity, and you have something more than zero. That's what I can tell you. Now, in a perfect world, you're supposed to have a minimum of 30 minutes. But if we can conserve electricity, you might have more than that. And is it an emergency? Well, it depends. It might be. In IMC conditions, I would say it's an emergency. You need to get the airplane on the ground. VMC conditions, where you're going on a 3-hour flight, it might be in the best interest and it might be safe to continue. There are actually airplanes that don't have electrical systems. We have, older airplanes, Piper Cubs that are flying around. They do not have an electrical system. You have to hand prop the prop to get it going, to get the engine going, and there's nothing in the airplane that's electrical.
Yeah, that would be fun to fly and interesting to teach about because most might be shocked how those things work.
Yeah.
And then the avionics switch really is almost a something where we use to protect the avionics from maybe an overvoltage or something when we're starting the aircraft, or initially turning that key and that alternator fires up. We're trying to, I guess, isolate the avionics so that we don't overpower that bus and cause any damage to our expensive radios and or audio panel. So if you happen to pull the mixture out too far while taxiing, you really need to be diligent using your checklist and go through the start procedures, shutdown procedures, and the start procedures again to make sure you're protecting that equipment in that cockpit as well, for sure.
Yeah, and in most of these airplanes, a lot of the airplanes that I fly around, and the avionics is 50% of the value of the airplane.
No question.
And so. In a lot of the airplanes, the procedure for a perceived alternator failure is to reset the alternator. And you do that by turning it off and turning it back on. However, before you do that, most of the airplanes will tell you to turn the avionics master switch off. So if there is some sort of a spike, you won't fry your expensive radios.
Yeah. No question. Now, as we're recording this, you misspoke a little bit. The fuel tanks are the most valuable pieces of equipment in an aircraft right now as fuel continues to skyrocket.
Absolutely.
I saw a little video last night on the social media channels that I watch, and there was a guy packaging little bundles of gas and weighing them as if he was going to sell them like crack cocaine. It was quite comical. Fuel's very expensive right now.
Yeah,
at our home airport, it went up 75 cents a gallon on March 9th. So a 14% increase in one day.
Wow. I saw somebody post a picture, and again, social media, and it's like a husband and a wife, and they're at a desk, they're signing papers, and they say, "We've just closed on our loan to buy gas for the cars."
There you go. I hope we don't get to that point. That's going to be worse for sure.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about lights. These aircraft most of them all have some form of lighting systems. I can think of, we probably have a switch for nav lights. We probably have a switch for anti-collision or strobe lights. We probably have a beacon light bulb. We probably have a taxi light, maybe a landing light, maybe an interior light. That's probably all the lights we have on most of these trainers. The new wave of the future is going to be LED. I love my aircraft with LED lights. If I lose a non-LED light, I'm probably replacing with an LED light. Much more durable, probably lasts forever, and doesn't take near the power to run it, right? So as you talked guarantees on battery a while ago, if you're running a system that's all LEDs, you probably are going to get a lot more out of that battery than if you're running a bunch of incandescent light bulbs all the way around your aircraft as well.
Yeah. As we talk about lights, I remember back in my early days of beginning to fly charter, we had the company I worked for had 2 Beechcraft Barons and 1 Beechcraft Duchess. And when I was going through a little 2-day ground school about a Beechcraft Baron, one thing that the instructor was very adamant about, he said, you need to be very aware of if anything is hot wired to the battery. And what he meant is there any system on the airplane that you can turn on and it will come on without the master switch being on? And his point was, in some of these airplanes, they have baggage compartments and they have lights in the baggage compartment. And guess what? Those lights are normally hot wired to the battery. And I ran into this with my Saratoga, a year and a half ago. And we had a dead battery. Had a dead battery in the Saratoga. So I got the mechanic to order a new battery. which wasn't cheap, and he installed it and everything, and we went out, and the airplane started up just fine, and life was good. We put the airplane in the hangar, and came back about 10 days later, pulled the airplane out, went to start it, and it would not start.
Did you throw the first battery away, Wally?
No, but
Okay.
I did go down to the shop and say to my mechanic, I say, hey, I just spent $800 on a battery and it doesn't work. And so they came down, and the Saratoga is a 12-volt system. We're able to jump start it and get it going. And what we determined was that the airplane, and I didn't even know it, but our airplane does have a baggage light. And guess what? That light was on. The last trip that we flew, we had things in the baggage compartment, and as we pulled it out, somebody inadvertently hit that switch. And so for 10 days, a little bitty light in the baggage compartment drained the battery. So something, that's a light that we normally don't think about as baggage compartment lights, but that was a pretty important lesson. So I've since removed the bulb from the light, so even if we hit the switch, it won't be an issue.
Yeah, this interesting read I had lately was an interpretation of a lighting system where if the beacon, if you have beacons and strobes, they can either be independent of one another or they can be one system. And the FAA says if any three of those lights are out, if they're one system, meaning one strobe light or the beacon out, then that can't be flown legally because it's part of the anti-collision in the anti-collision system, right? Whereas if they are separate, you could fly without the strobes because you do have a red flashing beacon light. And some of the newer, I think our 182 has a system that it's all in one. And so if we lose one of those bulbs, we have to replace it before we can fly that aircraft during day or night operations because of that interpretation letter. So
That's
you need to know your systems, you need to know your aircraft, and you need to know the rules and interpretations of those rules, because that sparked a good debate amongst instructors and maintenance before we found that interpretation letter.
And I think there's inconsistency on the naming of lights. We talk about nav lights. Well, the FAA calls them position lights. Anti-collision lights. Well, a beacon. Sometimes we call it a rotating beacon. Sometimes it's called a flashing beacon. That's an anti-collision light. A strobe light is an anti-collision light. Sometimes they're labeled anti-collision. Sometimes they're labeled strobes.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to know which switch is controlling which one and which ones you should have on and must have on for legal operations as well during the times that you're flying that aircraft.
And in a lot of airplanes, I know for a fact the Pipers, when you turn on some of the position lights, it's Piper's way of saying it must be nighttime. So then the three green gear lights are dimmer because they think it's nighttime. So you land and you leave the light switch on and you shut down the airplane and you go about your business, and you come back the next day, you get in the airplane, and it looks like you don't have three green gear lights. Well, it's because your nav lights are on because the airplane thinks it's night.
Yeah, that should be called the $200 dimmer switch, the little wheel in Pipers, because lots of people go out and they get in that Piper Arrow of ours and they start it up and they say, well, I ain't got three green lights, I'm not flying today. So they shut down the plane, come inside, and very often I can walk out there and demonstrate to them that if I roll that wheel up and it clicks, we're going to get three green lights. So, again, just another part of the systems that we need to understand and know how they work better.
Right.
Right. We cover a lot about the pitot-static during training because it's such an integral part of learning. So I think we can skip that one or do a whole nother show on maybe the pitot-static and the vacuum systems. One interesting part about the vacuum system that I've learned in the last few years is that I guess I always thought the vacuum system was a gyro that was being blown into, right? But the vacuum system actually is a suction, and it's being pulled. The air's being pulled through it, and there's a regulator on the other side so that it can't pull too fast and blow that gyro up or spin it too fast. So that's an interesting fact about the vacuum system, is that it is a suck pull system that has a regulator just in front of that to make sure that the air comes through at a certain pace, to keep that within its green arc for suction. Stall warning horn, maybe most don't know, some maybe know, but it's actually a suction as well. So the way you really test, and the POH here, this old POH I'm reading, says put a clean cloth over the suction port or the stall horn port and suck softly and hear the whistle blow. You're probably not going to catch me doing that. They do sell little handheld suction devices that you can test your vacuums with, your stall horns with. But normally if you look in there and there's a little bit of plastic looking whistle in there, it's probably going to operate fine. But we have had those fail as well and had to have those replaced. So it is the airflow is coming over that wing, creating a vacuum there, and it is actually sucking it to make that stall horn go off. If it's a manual, I guess there are electric that have a switch that you can test as well.
Yeah.
Any other systems in these single engine small aircraft that we fly, Wally, that you think is just not understood or known well?
I mentioned earlier, I think it's maybe the trim tab system. What are you actually moving when you're trimming nose up? Which way are you trimming that? And is that it's kind of graduate level 172, yep. I would say. But that's kind of nice to know. I know flight school that I worked at, my very first CFI job, we had Cessna 150s, and the back of those airplanes just have on the rudder, they have a rudder trim tab, and it's a manual piece of aluminum. And the way you would put it in the right position is you would bend it, you'd get in the airplane and see if the airplane flew straight and level and coordinated. And if it didn't, you came down, you bent it a little more, and you got back in the airplane. And we used to have students all the time that would, new students, they would go out and they would say, hey, this piece of metal on the back of the rudder was bent, so I just reached up and I bent it back. I fixed it for you. And we would just roll our eyes and think, oh, no, it's going to take another 8 to 10 flights to get that thing in the exact right position, because it's compensating a little bit for some of the inherent turning tendencies of the airplane.
Yes, I hate when anybody says they went and bent something to help me.
Yeah,
that's never really a good thing.
Right,
for sure. Well, again, another good episode on systems. Hopefully, we're making you better, smarter pilots. These were all on single-engine aircraft that hopefully will benefit the majority of our listeners today. As always, fly safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.